In 1968, during the peak of the wet season, Long Bin Base had turned into an endless expanse of red mud, clinging to everything. Boots, vehicle tires, even the nerves of the men stationed there. Diesel fumes mingled with the damp earth, saturating every tent, every barrack, every uniform with a heavy, humid weight. Amid the sprawling chaos of the base, the mess hall was one of the few places where the war seemed to release its grip, if only for a few minutes. Here, ordinary sounds dominated: the clang of metal trays, boots scraping against concrete floors, arguments over mail or rations, whispers of rumors from Saigon. The morning began like any other. Soldiers ate, joked, complained. Green Berets, Navy corpsmen, MACV advisors all sat shoulder to shoulder, enduring the heat, fatigue, and the constant pressure of the jungle beyond the perimeter. Everything seemed routine, predictable, until the doorway darkened. He walked in alone. No entourage, no exaggerated display of rank. His rifle rested casually against his shoulder, a natural extension of his body, not a show of force. Every movement was deliberate, measured, as if he were stepping not into a room, but into the very air itself. And then the effect happened instantly. A table of Green Berets froze mid-bite. A Navy corpsman paused, tray suspended in his hands. Others rose silently, abandoning their meals and chairs without a single word. The air seemed to hold its breath. This was not panic. It was recognition. Subtle, immediate, absolute. Every man in the room understood something without anyone speaking. Sergeant First Class Raymond Kowalski watched carefully. He had been in country long enough to distinguish fear from respect, superstition from instinct, arrogance from awareness. He had smoked cigarettes with Montagnard scouts who slept with knives under their pillows. He had eaten with South Korean Tiger Division soldiers who unnerved MPS. He had survived firefights that would have shattered lesser men. Yet he had never seen elite American operators rise from a table in silence, collectively, without explanation. Who is this? Kowalski whispered to the master sergeant next to him. Australian SAS, came the quiet reply, almost like a shadow. Nui Dat. The man sat alone, opening a ration tin with the precision of a surgeon. His uniform had faded in the harsh sun to match the jungle floor. His boots were modified, soles cut and reshaped to mimic barefoot contact with the earth, not for comfort, but for stealth, deception, and adaptation. Every movement was calculated, merged seamlessly with the surroundings. His eyes were calm, unblinking, absorbing every detail. They belonged to a man who had crossed boundaries most soldiers would never approach, and returned irrevocably changed. By 1968, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, operating out of Nui Dat in Puak Tui Province, had quietly built a legend beyond even the most celebrated American units. Hundreds of confirmed enemy kills, patrols executed with 0 casualties, 5 men at a time, yet their operational effect was staggering. American Special Forces measured success in ratios. Australians produced near absolute results. The air of the mess hall had shifted. Conversations resumed, but the soldiers' movements were measured, their voices quieter, their eyes flicking toward the doorway unconsciously. Recognition, not fear, had forced a subtle, permanent shift in their perception. These men were witnessing something beyond doctrine, beyond training. Excellence exacted a cost, and mastery left traces that could not be undone. The Australians arrived in Puak Tui Province in 1966 and established their base at Nui Dat, a former rubber plantation surrounded by dense jungle, scrub, and scattered villages. American planners expected conventional Western behavior: short patrols, radio check-ins, helicopter extractions, fire support standing by. Instead, they encountered disappearance and silence that unsettled even the most experienced liaison officers. After insertion, a patrol would often remain motionless for 24 hours or more, not to rest, not to hide, but to listen, observe, and understand. Every sound became information: bird calls, insect rhythms, wind through leaves, distant human activity. Deviations from these natural patterns revealed the presence of humans, enemy or civilian. Each step was deliberate. Leaves were displaced silently, twigs bent rather than broken. Conversations occurred without sound, through subtle gestures. Movements synchronized with the rhythm of the jungle, not the pace of conventional military doctrine. While American patrols measured progress in kilometers per day, Australians measured in meters. Every pause was tactical, every observation deliberate. Tracking was elevated to an art form. Operators trained alongside Aboriginal trackers, who had read the land for tens of thousands of years. They taught the Australians to read soil compression, subtle disturbances of spider webs, variations in plant growth, and the behavior of small animals. A bent blade of grass indicated passage within hours. Disturbed webs revealed height and width of a person. Soil composition revealed weight and load. An Australian patrol did not stumble on the enemy. They predicted his location, sometimes days in advance, and decided whether engagement was necessary at all. American observers were unnerved. They were accustomed to action: rapid insertion, contact, extraction. The Australians were masters of presence. They could shadow enemy units for days, memorizing routines, noting vulnerabilities, mapping jungle geometry with uncanny precision. Sometimes they never fired a shot. Sometimes they waited for a single moment that would ripple across the largest area, affecting enemy behavior long after the patrol had vanished. When engagements occurred, they were surgical. Ambushes were swift and precise, noise minimized, extraction deliberate. Every body, every item, every disturbance of the environment was calculated to deliver a psychological message. Intelligence reports described it as psychological exploitation of battlefield artifacts. To Australians, it was ritual, ambiguity, not spectacle, fear through invisible certainty. The effect on Viet Cong units was immediate. Supply lines were disrupted. Units refused to enter plantations or jungle corridors after single patrol actions. Survivors concluded that informants existed within their ranks. Paranoia spread faster than any conventional attack could achieve. The jungle itself seemed to betray them. American officers observed in silence. Efficiency was undeniable, but it came at a cost: psychological, emotional, and moral. Operators compressed emotion, suppressed instinctive fear, endured isolation, and remained hyper-alert for days. Bonds were functional, trust operational, not expressive. Civilian reintegration was difficult. Family relationships strained. Hyper-awareness persisted. Jungle consciousness never switched off. Night patrols demonstrated extreme discipline. Under dense canopy, patrols moved like shadows. Moonlight barely penetrated leaves. Sounds of insects, frogs, and distant human activity became instruments of understanding enemy behavior. One 5-man patrol followed an enemy supply team for 3 nights without engagement, noting positions, routines, and weaknesses. When they finally struck, a single target was neutralized. Extraction was silent. The remaining enemy abandoned territory, haunted by the unseen presence. American forces struggled to quantify results. Helicopters, artillery, and manpower gave technological superiority. But the Australians operated in another dimension, a psychological battlefield, where patience, presence, and observation mattered more than numbers or firepower. McAvee reports quietly acknowledged the disparity. Terrain, enemy quality, and support could not explain it. Recommendations were bureaucratic. Observe, learn selectively, do not integrate. Political risk, ethical ambiguity, and moral responsibility prevented adoption. Excellence demanded a cost that institutions could not endorse publicly. The SAS method had a name: jungle consciousness. Operators merged with the environment, understanding patterns, rhythms, and behavior. This produced what psychologists later called a predator mindset. Fear, fatigue, and moral hesitation became secondary. Targets were no longer enemies in the conventional sense, but elements in a system to be observed, influenced, and neutralized. American Green Berets noticed immediately. They admired results, respected discipline, but understood the price. Operators could not simply return to conventional operations or civilian life unchanged. Long-term studies of Vietnam-era SAS veterans revealed persistent hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and difficulty reintegrating. Some described feeling permanently misaligned, too quiet, too alert, too removed. Patrols operated in silence that broke American units within days. Observation, patience, and subtle manipulation of evidence allowed the SAS to control entire zones. Supply lines were disrupted, enemy units abandoned regions, and civilians adapted to the perception of invisible watchers. Success was measured not by body count, but by behavioral change and operational control. By late 1968, the reputation of the Australians was quietly legendary among American forces. Mess halls emptied at the sight of a lone Australian, not from fear, but recognition of mastery. The empty seats told a story no report would. Some forms of excellence demanded a cost few institutions were willing to pay. By late 1968, the Australians' effectiveness had quietly become the subject of whispered conversations among American forces. Hundreds of confirmed kills, 0 casualties on patrols, and countless disrupted enemy operations painted a picture. But numbers alone did not capture the full impact. It was the psychological collapse that radiated outward, reshaping entire operational zones. Viet Cong units behaved differently in regions where the Australians operated. Supply runners abandoned routes. Entire platoons avoided plantations and jungle corridors. Tax collectors and local administrators withdrew from villages. The jungle seemed to claim territory not by force, but by the certainty of unseen watchers. The SAS's approach was not to fight for conventional victory, but to create conditions of inevitability. Engagements were surgical and selective. Individuals were neutralized with precision over days or weeks, leaving evidence that suggested intimate knowledge of enemy routines. The message was unmistakable. They were being watched, and the observer could choose the moment of consequence. American officers were struck not by brutality, but by efficiency. A 5-man patrol achieved what a battalion could not. Areas of the jungle were denied without permanent occupation. Conventional operations, search and destroy missions, artillery and helicopter insertions, could not reproduce these effects. Within MACV, analysts struggled. Comparative assessments concluded that terrain, enemy quality, or support could not explain the disparity. American units, despite superior firepower and manpower, could not replicate Australian results. Recommendations were cautious. Observe, learn selectively, do not integrate. Political risk, ethical ambiguity, and moral responsibility created a barrier no general wanted to cross. Excellence demanded a cost institutions could not publicly endorse. The Australians called it jungle consciousness. Operators became attuned to the rhythms of the environment, merging human and natural patterns into one operational awareness. This produced what psychologists later termed a predator mindset, a state where fear, fatigue, and moral hesitation became secondary to purpose. Targets were no longer enemies in the conventional sense, but elements to be observed, influenced, and neutralized with precision. American Green Berets recognized the brilliance of the approach, but understood its cost. Hyper-awareness, emotional suppression, and functional bonds distinguished these operators. Reintegration into civilian life or conventional operations was rarely complete. Emotional detachment and alertness persisted, a constant reminder of the jungle's influence. Patrols moved silently, reading the environment like a language. Small signs, leaf bends, disturbed spiderwebs, soil compression, revealed human presence. Observing for days without engagement, they struck only at moments maximizing operational or psychological effect. Engagements were precise, extraction deliberate, minimal traces left behind. Yet the ripple effects extended far beyond. Enemy units abandoned regions, fearing unseen hunters. Villages went silent. The jungle itself became an instrument of control. SAS patrols subtly manipulated terrain and evidence to amplify fear and confusion. Footprints, discarded items, even bodies positioned with intention, created psychological messages, magnified by local spiritual beliefs. Viet Cong units interpreted these signs as evidence of an almost supernatural precision. Fear spread faster than bullets. American officers quietly admitted that the Australians had achieved what technology, artillery, and helicopters could not. Traditional success metrics, body counts, territory gained, did not apply. Australians measured success by behavioral change, operational disruption, and psychological control. Their presence altered enemy perception and behavior without conventional confrontation. Civilian and enemy perception became part of the battlefield. The SAS had not merely defeated units, they had reshaped the enemy's cognition. Viet Cong paranoia spread internally, cells dismantled themselves, and territories became effectively denied without sustained occupation. Efficiency and subtlety replaced brute force, leaving American observers in awe and unease. Even in garrison, the effects were visible. Soldiers recalled mess halls emptied silently in recognition of a single Australian's presence. It was not fear, but acknowledged mastery. The invisible hand of the SAS created effects that conventional metrics could not quantify. Some forms of excellence demanded a cost few institutions were willing to pay. The Australians moved through the jungle as though it were an extension of themselves. American units relied on technology, heavy firepower, and rapid movement. SAS patrols relied on patience, observation, and intimate knowledge of their environment. A 5-man patrol could dominate terrain that a full American battalion struggled to secure. At night, the jungle became a living map. Sounds of insects, distant footfalls, and subtle shifts in the canopy all conveyed information. Deviations from the natural rhythm revealed human presence, enemy or civilian. Every movement was deliberate. Leaves brushed aside, twigs bent rather than broken. Conversations conducted silently through gestures. While American patrols measured kilometers per day, Australians measured in meters, each pause tactical, each observation precise. Tracking elevated to an art. Operators trained with Aboriginal trackers, learning to read soil, vegetation, and animal behavior. A bent blade of grass could indicate recent passage. A disturbed spider web suggested height and body width. The Australians predicted enemy movement, often days ahead, and decided whether engagement was necessary at all. American observers were unnerved. Rapid insertion, contact, and extraction were foreign to these methods. The SAS was built around presence. Patrols could shadow enemy units for days, memorizing routines and vulnerabilities. Sometimes no shots were fired. When engagement occurred, it was surgical. Extraction was silent. Traces were minimal, but the effects were massive. Enemy units abandoned territory, fearful of unseen observers. Psychological warfare was embedded in operations. Footprints, discarded items, or even bodies positioned deliberately conveyed messages amplified by local spiritual beliefs. Viet Cong interpreted this as almost supernatural precision. Fear spread faster than bullets. Supply lines were disrupted. Platoons refused to enter plantations or jungle corridors. Paranoia led to internal purges and the disbanding of units. American officers struggled to reconcile results with doctrine. Success for them was measured by firepower and territory. For the Australians, it was behavioral change, operational disruption, and psychological control. A battalion could destroy enemy forces, but could not make them vanish psychologically, as the SAS did. The SAS method, jungle consciousness, produced what psychologists later defined as a predator mindset. Operators suppressed instinctive fear and emotion, enduring isolation and hyper-awareness. Bonds were functional, not expressive. Reintegration into civilian life was difficult. Hypervigilance persisted. Soldiers were permanently shaped by their environment. Even garrison life reflected their discipline. Mess halls emptied at the approach of a single Australian, not from fear, but from acknowledged mastery. The presence of operators demonstrated the human cost of excellence. Some forms of skill demanded sacrifices few institutions could support. Night patrols reinforced dominance without direct confrontation. One 5-man team could follow an enemy unit for days, memorizing routines and weaknesses. When engagement occurred, it was precise and isolated, leaving psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate action. Supply lines collapsed, enemy units abandoned regions, and civilians adapted to the perception of invisible watchers. American forces quietly recognized the significance. Helicopters, artillery, and superior numbers could not replicate these results. The Australians had rewritten irregular warfare. Control over perception and behavior replaced brute force. Even without official reports acknowledging it, Green Berets and intelligence officers understood that the SAS had achieved mastery of both environment and enemy, creating outcomes far greater than the size of their teams suggested. By 1969, the Australians' presence in Phuoc Tuy province had left a mark far beyond the battlefield. Viet Cong units no longer moved freely. Entire villages fell silent, not from destruction, but from the perception of omnipresent observers. Supply routes were abandoned. Planners found previously reliable routes useless. Psychological dominance had become more decisive than firepower, artillery, or air support. The jungle itself seemed under control, not through occupation, but through invisible mastery. American officers reflected on what they had witnessed. The Australians had achieved results that challenged every assumption of modern, irregular warfare. A 5-man patrol produced effects that conventional battalions could not. Patrols moved through the jungle with precision, patience, and discipline that bordered on obsessive. The enemy's collapse was not just physical, but mental. Paranoia, fear, and self-doubt spread through Viet Cong units faster than bullets ever could. MACV headquarters had quietly reviewed comparative reports. The findings were clear. Terrain, enemy quality, and support could not explain the disparity. Yet, formal adoption of these methods was impossible. Ethical and political constraints prevented replication. To train American operators in the same way would require altering not just skills, but identity, psychology, and emotional resilience. Excellence had a cost, and the institution could not endorse it publicly. For the Australians themselves, the price was real. Long-term studies revealed persistent hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. Operators became functional, efficient, and operationally lethal, but social bonds suffered. Family relationships strained. Normal life felt misaligned, too quiet, too slow, too uncontrolled. Jungle consciousness never switched off. The men who walked through the mess halls of Long Binh were different forever. In contrast, American Green Berets observed and learned selectively, respecting the discipline, but not fully integrating the methods. They admired the results but understood the cost. Excellence in the field was one thing. Returning home intact was another. The Pentagon's cautious recommendation, to observe but not adopt, reflected a balance between military effectiveness and human cost. Viet Cong suffered silently. Orders to avoid areas patrolled by Australians, reports of invisible hunters, and the belief in supernatural precision fractured units internally. Intelligence gathered from these patrols demonstrated that fear alone could dismantle cohesion. Supply lines, command structures, and local support networks collapsed without a single large-scale firefight. The Australians had achieved what conventional forces could not: psychological and operational dominance through invisibility. The impact extended beyond Vietnam. Lessons in observation, patience, and adaptation informed limited future special operations. But the full integration of SAS-style jungle consciousness remained classified. Ethics, political risk, and public perception constrained doctrine. Techniques that worked perfectly on the battlefield were too intense, too transformative, and too psychologically demanding to teach en masse. Yet among those who served alongside or observed them, The reputation of the Australians was legendary. Mess halls emptied at their approach, patrols moved with awareness of their presence, and intelligence reports carried whispers of invisible hunters. The empty chairs at Long Bin told a story the official record would never acknowledge. Some forms of excellence demanded a price few institutions could pay. The Australians had redefined irregular warfare. The jungle was not just terrain. It was a partner, a medium through which awareness, patience, and precision produced dominance. Enemy collapse came not through firepower alone, but through understanding, adaptation, and manipulation of perception. The methods were quiet, subtle, devastating. By the end of their tours, it was clear. The war could be fought in ways American doctrine had never imagined. Numbers, technology, and brute force were secondary to observation, patience, and psychological mastery. For the men on the ground, the lessons were unforgettable. Green Berets, intelligence officers, and liaison personnel carried memories of encounters that challenged every assumption about combat, warfare, and human capability. Ultimately, the story of the Australians in Phuoc Tuy province was one of discipline, adaptation, and transformation. Not just of the battlefield, but of the men themselves. Their legacy was invisible but undeniable. Enemy units destabilized without confrontation, civilians influenced without force, and Allied observers left in awe and quiet respect. Some lessons were adopted, many were not, but the impact was lasting. Excellence had a cost, and in the dense jungles of Vietnam, the Australians had paid it fully, while changing the very nature of what it meant to be an elite warrior.